are you and why are you here? Are we gonna live life in fear, or are we gonna stand up and make sure we're heard? Are we gonna hide or live life by our word? With integrity we can be all that we can see in our mind's eye until we're finally free. We can become whatever we choose once we know the choice lies within me and you. Now's the time to wake up. No time for playing small. With a painful history and an uncertain future, now is the time to evolve. Hello, and welcome to the Unapologetically Human podcast with Dan Boyven. Thank you so much for being here. This is a podcast about trying to understand myself, each other, and this crazy modern world that we live in, as I like to say if you're been around here before. But also something you may have heard me talk about quite a number of times, which doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon. This episode has taken me a lot longer to release than I told my guest, or I would have liked to myself. There's a number of reasons for that. I've talked about different resistances I have. My somewhat typical challenges with time management and just prioritizing what I do with my time can be challenging, especially I've been going through a breakup the last few months that has been quite challenging, and I haven't exactly been dealing with it in the best ways that I could, and so I've been, you could say, focused on avoiding my feelings more than getting my work done on certain things. But there was one other thing that sort of came up when I was editing this episode and writing notes for creating the show notes. I had this sense that I didn't have a very good segue or a clear explanation of a major part of the conversation when I wanted to ask Andrei about this story that he had sort of told me a little bit about, but it's part of the reason I had him on the podcast was to tell the full story of how he essentially was hunted down and canceled by some stranger on the internet who didn't like something that he wrote, and then tried to find out who he was and where he worked and get him fired and yada yada yada, all that fun stuff that's happening in our culture right now. So I guess a little bit of the resistance to really getting this episode up has been a bit of regular procrastination, some other circumstances like the ending of a relationship and dealing with that, regular resistance, something that I've been really wanting to do for a long time is to, get some support for the amount of time and effort that I am putting into making this podcast, as I have a normal full-time job and I'm trying to, create this on the side, and it can be challenging to feel like there's a lot of one-sided work going in and not seeing a lot of results. But that being said, I did finally publish my Patreon page, so I've put a link in the show notes for that. And if you appreciate what I've been doing with the show, finding some value from what I've been creating, then it would be amazing, and I'd be super grateful if you'd consider becoming a patron. That'll really help me get some validation that what I'm doing matters, and that there are people out there that want to support what I'm doing here. And you can also support the show by liking and sharing and commenting, um, giving a review on Apple, all that good stuff. But yeah, here's a conversation with another budding friendship with my friend Andrei. And we basically start off with him giving a little bit of his educational and work background. He tells the story of how he was hunted down and canceled. We talk about the couple articles that he wrote, including a lot of what's going on with the identity politics and a lot of the ideological groupthink and controversies that are happening in our culture right now. How we're going to overcome it, how we can talk to each other better, especially when we disagree with people, and what this means for the state of our society currently and going forward. So, without further ado, here's a conversation about the challenging and transformational times that we find ourselves in. Hope you enjoy. All right, well, we can kind of just get right into it. I just want to say thanks so much for meeting me. It's been really interesting getting to know each other online the past couple of years now. It's been and I think I don't really have any notes to go off or anything. I took a few screenshots of a couple parts of your article, but I think why don't you just kind of tell me a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background. You also had mentioned that you're Russian, right?
That's right.
So I imagine maybe at some point, a bit later on, we might kind of touch upon what's happening with the war with Russia and Ukraine and some of the different dynamics of how that kind of relates to some of this stuff that we're seeing with kind of the cancel culture and the ideological identity politics and stuff like that. So tell me a little bit about yourself, and then I think a lot of times... Oh, excuse me.
Order for Austin?
No.
This is...
Not us.
No.
No.
My
It's okay. That's so awesome. This is actually really funny anyway, because
This is...
I always put bloopers at the end of every episode. I love putting bloopers. And so the podcast is called Unapologetically Human. And what I like to say, like when I first started it, I had like a list of 15 things, like relationships, mental health, addiction, a lot of family history with that type of stuff, personal history, politics, social issues, tech, science, philosophy, art, wisdom, psychedelics, kind of this like all-encompassing thing. And people are like, so what the fuck is this about? And what I like to say is it's certainly, in a way, it's about me, and it's about trying to explain how I see the world, and it's my journey trying to understand myself, understand other people, and understand this crazy world that we live in, particularly in the context of what does it mean to be a human in the modern world when we've seen so much crazy technological advancement and scientific advancement.
Human as opposed to a consumer.
Yeah, exactly. And how can we understand the world, which obviously many of us are having a very, very hard time doing, right?
Absolutely.
But and also just unapologetically human is also about like showing the messy parts. So that's part of the fun, and also just trying to talk about serious things and understand things in a serious way while also having some levity and whatnot too. But so tell me a little bit about yourself, and then a lot of times I look at this sort of project for myself as being conversations rather than interviews. Like, I like to talk to you, not just ask questions, but based on the time we have and those articles that you read, I really want to kind of give you the floor to speak about kind of like what made you write them, the first one in particular,
and then the story of kind of like what were you doing at the time, what happened, because you had mentioned you got fired from a couple different places. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, and I kind of want to give you the floor because the articles are really well written. I'll obviously
thank you.
Share them in the show notes. And yeah, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, Dan, it's a pleasure to finally meet you, first of all, and thank you for inviting me here. To tell you a little story, brief story of my life so far, I'm an immigrant kid, came to Canada 20 years ago from Russia. I went to high school here, then I went to U of T, I studied political science, and then I got into the corporate world.
Fun.
The first real job was very interesting because I was given considerable responsibility from day one, and I had zero expectations. First of all, I was confused after graduating. I was like, well, what am I going to do now? And this first job was eye-opening in many ways. I worked in HR and payroll, so I was kind of in between. I worked for a mining company, Vale. It's a Brazilian mining company. They acquired Inco, I think a couple of years prior to me joining them, and all the miners up north in Sudbury, they had just come back from a year-long strike. And so
wow.
It was, so
a long strike.
Oh yeah, fully paid by the company, by the way.
Wow.
It was my job to interact with them on a day-to-day basis because Inco, they were under-investing in IT, so they were still using an MS-DOS-based system. As you can imagine, plenty of errors and people pissed up north. Anyway, it was very interesting to observe human behavior, observe how some people didn't get along with each other in payroll, and I was thinking, like, you guys are adults, and yet some of you hate each other and don't get along. And it was fascinating for me to observe human behavior. Another interesting observation for me was kind of early on in my life as to like why are people unhappy with their jobs. I remember sitting across from this guy. He was probably in his 50s, I imagine, a senior IT person, and I was sitting across from him every single day, and I was thinking, why are you here? Like, why is that person sitting there working? He's probably getting paid good money because he's managing complex projects around the world. But I kept asking myself, like, do I see myself being his age, sitting there at a desk, managing some whatever IT project in Singapore or whatever? And I was terrified. Because the answer was definitely
like,
no.
Please, dear Lord, no.
Please, yes, exactly. So that thought really scared me. Because I realized that individual probably doesn't want to be there, but for whatever, reason and due to life circumstances, that's the job he has. I wasn't sure if he was enjoying that job. And I definitely didn't see myself enjoying that kind of job.
Yeah.
And I had a good manager. That's one thing that's really important, I think, in any workplace, is having
For sure.
A good person who trusts you, who isn't afraid to give you responsibility. And I had a pretty big responsibility because most of those phone calls, they were not, oh, thank you for doing a great job. No, they were angry. They were like, why I didn't get paid last week for whatever, 5 hours, overtime hours or whatever. And that's where I learned communication skills and how to interact with people, how to work within an environment where adults don't necessarily get along. Eventually, I I left that job after being offered a full-time job with like good pay and everything. I said, look, guys, I'm not interested in HR, like at all. So I appreciate the offer, but by
yeah. See you later. Thanks for the offer.
Yeah.
No thanks.
So that was my introduction to the corporate world, and then afterwards I was like, okay, what's next? And for some reason I brainwashed myself into thinking that it's got to be Bay Street. I got to work on Bay Street.
Right.
I got to rub shoulders, or elbows with CEOs and CFOs of major corporations. And, eventually I did end up getting a job on Bay Street.
Really?
Mm-hmm. At the Royal Bank of Canada. But it turned out to be very different from my expectations, like the opposite of my expectations. But I'm very grateful for that experience.
So what were your expectations? And how did it turn out?
I don't know, a good salary, the ability to travel and being exposed to the world of investments, and I could have maybe ended up climbing that corporate ladder. But my experience was the opposite of what I had in mind. It was more of an admin job, and there wasn't a whole lot of training provided. My manager, I don't think she liked me, I'll be honest with you. I detested her micromanagement of me, and with no proper training, my job kept getting progressively more difficult because the nature of tasks that I was given was getting more complicated. I was working with like multi-million-dollar loans that I had to process. So essentially, my job was to make sure that whatever Caterpillar, Coca-Cola gets their share of, say, a $20 or $30 million loan that RBC was responsible for. And eventually I ended up making a mistake. I closed a loan that wasn't supposed to be closed, and my manager was like, come with me. So we ended up in a room just like this. We sat down, and then she told me it was December 26th, I think. There were 2 more weeks until New Year's, and she told me, look, you are the worst thing that has happened to this department. Please don't come to work. Like, you're fired. Please don't come to work for the next 2 weeks.
So she let you down easy.
Stay home. We'll pay you for the the remaining 2 weeks. Just don't come to work. And you're done. You can leave now. Pack your stuff and leave. And that was a wake-up call in many ways. It was I forgot to say that a lot of the people who I was working with, they seemed different from me. They were not as extroverted as I am. They seemed okay with this monotonous job, and it was very monotonous. It was like a robot. You go grab a fax from some corporate bank in New York, you come back, you process the loan in like 3 or 4 different systems. It was a very boring job.
That you weren't really trained in.
Nothing. I had a good chair though. I had a Herman Miller Aeron chair.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't all shit.
Pros and cons. Gotta keep a good perspective. So, it was, in many ways, it was a wake up call for me to, I started asking myself all these questions like, what's important in my life? what do I want to do? Why did I end up in that situation, and how? What did I learn from that situation? Because even though my manager might not have liked me and I didn't like the job, there was a valuable lesson in that experience that I picked for myself. And that's a whole different topic. And I know that I picked that experience for myself to realize things about my personality and about myself and what's important to me in this lifetime. So I think that experience prompted me to explore entrepreneurship. And so in 2012, shortly after leaving RBC, I co-founded a tech startup with business partners of mine, and it was a roller coaster in many ways. It was stressful and exciting. We were part of the Digital Media Zone incubator for around 2 years. And
at Ryerson?
Yeah.
I mean,
Ryerson.
TMU.
Well, at the time it was Ryerson. I still call it Ryerson.
Yeah. Well, it's like the Sky Dome. Or
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Amphitheater.
I still call it Sky Dome after all those years.
Because it will forever be Sky Dome.
Exactly. So it was an exciting journey. I was able to connect with so many cool entrepreneurs and learn how to work with developers, something I've never done before. Once we raised some money, we were able to hire developers, and I was able to learn new skills like web design. So I designed all of our products. So I learned UX design, UI design, product management, project management, things like that. And it was an exciting journey. I was a co-founder for around 4 years between 2012 and 2016. I left that company at the end of 2016, and in 2017 I decided to pursue e-commerce. So I launched my own brand on Shopify. I had my own store for a couple of years, and then because I was doing drop shipping, which means you don't own any inventory. When somebody places an order, you in turn place an order with your supplier, and my suppliers were in China. So it took a long time to ship products. I was not in control of packaging, customer experience, nothing really. And it prompted me to explore a different business venture whereby I was in control of those things. And so that's when I started looking into Amazon, and decided to pursue a new e-commerce venture on Amazon, which involved buying a lot of expensive inventory in China, doing a lot of research into different products and categories. And I can tell you Amazon is a very competitive marketplace. I decided to do business on .com as opposed to .ca because that's where the demand is. And in many ways it was an exciting journey. I learned a lot along the way about building a brand on Amazon, running ads on Amazon, delighting my customers with great customer service. And so I was doing that for a couple of years until ClearCo contacted me. It's a company run by Michelle Romano and Andrew D'Souza. I was headhunted. I was contacted by a recruiter. She told me about this opportunity to be a coach. And I was like, awesome. When do I start? So I joined ClearCo last year, and I was responsible for coaching close to 140 e-commerce founders.
Wow.
Mainly in the United States. I would say 80% US-based, 15% Canada-based, and then 5% UK-based. It gave me exposure to all sorts of entrepreneurs working on really cool, products. Everything from, scented candles to clothes to skincare products, just like across the entire spectrum of products. I met some really cool people. I had a great team. I had a great manager, like fantastic manager. I learned a lot from him, I can tell you that. And I really enjoyed working with him. I was able to observe him and learn some of the skills that I probably don't have. But now I'd like to think that I do.
What kind of skills?
I would say that he is good at listening to people, working with people, protecting the interests of individuals on his team. He's incredibly diplomatic, like to the point of being pedantic. And he's just a genuinely good person, whose emotional IQ, if you happen to subscribe to it and believe in that sort of stuff, I would say it's pretty high. Like I'm more
I think it's
emotional, impatient.
Definitely a thing.
Yeah, I don't have the patience for some of the things, but I learned to be patient from him. I learned to be able to listen to people and sometimes take a step back. And so I learned a lot on that job. I enjoyed working with every single person there. But unfortunately, due to the economic situation, Clearco, they laid off about 25% of their staff.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. They sold their overseas division to a different company and decided to focus on the North American market. So yeah, I'm
not surprising. It's been a rough couple of years.
That's right. Yeah. So unfortunately, I'm no longer with Clearco, but I'm sure something else will come my way. When one door closes, another door opens. So I'm in the transition phase at the moment.
Okay, so let's back up a bit, because you said that when you joined Clearco was last year. So let's tell me about what you were up to and where you're at. And thanks for sharing all that. It's a good sort of primer that you've had a lot of different types of experiences with a lot of different types of people, and you've been able to experience a lot of different types of responsibility. And it's interesting. I think the vast majority of people, and this has been my experience largely, are just being a worker at a place, not having their own experience going through an entrepreneurial journey. I have had that, luckily, myself as well. I've done some entrepreneur courses and whatnot. Tried starting a clothing brand with a buddy of mine a few years ago. My longest best friend ended up, our visions started going in different ways. We started fighting a lot. It almost destroyed our friendship, so I walked away from it. But tell me a little bit about what you were up to in 2020. Kind of you were coaching through the entrepreneur. What was it, like an incubator kind of?
In 2020?
Yeah. So tell me what you're up to before what happened with George Floyd's murder, and then you subsequently wrote that article, and you had mentioned that you got fired. Let's kind of go into that stuff a little bit.
Oh, yeah, sure. So at the time, I had my own e-commerce business. And then the events of 2020 happened. So why did I write that article? I was following events on social media. I was reading the news, and
actually, hold on a sec. I just want to I'll get I have just a couple little stats here. So, George Floyd was murdered. May 25th, 2020 was the date. And then you had wrote this article, Evidence-Based Examination of Systemic Police Bias in the United States, on July 6th, 2020. So it was, about a month and a half ish after that happened, and I read this article, and I actually was thinking of either recording it myself. I always do an intro before kind of popping into the conversation, so I'll do that after. I thought about maybe I'll just read the whole article, because I thought about reading like some of the key stats, but I found myself highlighting almost the entire article because it's very objective, it's very stats heavy, and these are statistics that are coming from, what was it, like the Washington Post database of police shooting data in the United States, stats that are being pulled directly from the FBI statistics off their website, all sorts of stuff. And yeah, so what prompted you to write this article?
I didn't believe, and I still don't, that police in the United States in 2020 and 2021 are racist.
Mm-hmm.
That claim seemed preposterous to me. But I needed evidence.
Mm-hmm.
I needed hard data to be able to articulate an argument that was based on facts, objective facts. And I set out to research this topic because it just seemed the rhetoric being used just didn't make sense to me, so something didn't seem right. And I'm not, I haven't written any such article prior to that.
Right.
If you look at my articles, I wrote about back in 2015, I wrote about some marketing stuff.
Yeah.
I've never written about aside from all the essays that I wrote at U of T in my poli-sci classes.
Yeah.
I've never written anything like this before. So, it took me a couple of days to research the data, to put it all together, to analyze it, create a coherent flow. And it's tragic what happened.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to deny. It's absolutely tragic that that particular individual died as a result of actions of specific police officers who are now in jail for their actions. But I don't buy the premise that police officers in the United States are all racist. And so the data clearly shows why African American citizens are over-policed. Because, unfortunately, I'm not going to say 13% because it's not 13%, and I explain why. Normally people would say 13% of Americans are responsible for about 52 to 53% of homicides. That number is not true because it is not fair to African Americans who are not responsible for crime. If you look at the statistics, the elderly folks have nothing to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Kids have nothing to do with it.
Of course.
Females, for the most part, are not involved.
No, it's young men.
It's young men between, I would say, 18 and 40.
Yeah.
They account for roughly speaking, 3% of the population.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So when you have 3% of the population being responsible for 52 to 53% of homicides nationwide, well, what questions can you have about this? Of course, you're going to have over-policing in those neighborhoods because of disproportionate representation of young black males when it comes to the perpetrators of homicides.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you that a lot of folks living in those predominantly black communities, they want and expect police presence because they want to feel safe. from individuals who engage in crime. That sort of narrative, objective, fact-based narrative, was nowhere to be found at the time. And that's what upset me, because I believe in objective truth, and this is a difficult topic, but it involves people's lives, especially those who've lost, their sons. Like, those moms are devastated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think one of the biggest challenges with this whole conversation is that kind of like the trajectory of events was that it's like, over the past several years leading up to the murder of George Floyd, there were these high profile killings of black people, unarmed in some cases, or in many of the big cases that really were featured so prominently in the media over the course of the last several years, that there has been a growing perception of indisputable evidence that police in America in particular, but the narrative goes everywhere else essentially the same, are killing unarmed black citizens at a
alarming rate.
And an alarming rate, and at a rate that is greater than the police killing unarmed white citizens or citizens of any other racial category. And so the death of George Floyd happened, and it was just the video of that. Like, I saw that video, I'm sure you saw that video, so many people saw this video of these 4 cops, one in particular, Derek Chauvin, kneeling on George Floyd's whole body, his back, 3 of them on his back, 1 of them on his neck, for almost 9 minutes, and then the guy dies. Mm-hmm. And there was what was then called the racial uprising, and this also was on the back of an already extremely stressed out population, who everyone in this whole generation experiencing a pandemic for the first time, and all of the insanity that has come along with that, which is only borne out to become more insane over the last couple of years. But then there was this racial uprising, and there's this narrative that really took hold from Black Lives Matter and was really pushed by the media. But what you were wanting to highlight was that something didn't seem right, that in 2022, that these killings, even if the data were to support them, were motivated by racism, basically. And so when you went digging for the stats, you actually were able to find the stats that actually the statistics don't support that narrative. And I was really interested when I read your article, because I thought it was really well done, and I was really impressed by the focus on the stats being the backbone of the sort of objective take of like, what's the actual statistics say. And I'm going to share this. I'll share your articles in the show notes, but also I listened to, I think we might have talked about it in the past, but I don't know if you've listened to this episode as well, but Sam Harris, who's a neuroscientist, he's obviously a very intelligent individual. I listened to, I think it was like an hour and a half to like a 2.5 hour podcast, I think called Can We Pull Back from the Brink? And this was around that time as well. And he went through an extremely thorough picking apart of that narrative based on what the statistics actually say as well. And it's just interesting because the environment that we found ourselves in then, and we continue to increasingly find ourselves in, is an environment that, we're emotional creatures, and people tend to seek out information to support their own biases, to support the beliefs that they already have. and they tend to disregard any information, regardless of where it comes from, regardless of how factual it may or may not be, if it doesn't support that, especially once we're tribalized into being on so-called sides of, you know, a narrative or a contentious issue. And then it's like, well, you know, there's this kind of like dichotomy of people that focus on the facts, and they're like, the facts don't fucking care about your feelings. But then the way people tend to actually operate, which we're able to see because there's been so many different controversies with the pandemic, the vaccines, the unvaccinated, the, you know, narrative of white supremacy and racism and misogyny, attacks on men and masculinity in general, as if all masculinity is toxic masculinity, and any exercise of trying to kind of like create something in your life is taken as a attempt to exercise power and oppression over other people. And there's just so much controversy in the last few years that we're seeing that, especially once people are tribalized and they're on a team, they don't care about facts. We like, and that's just, even if we're not, you know, the people in the middle often as well are like, we tend to hear something and kind of go with our gut feeling or our intuition about whether or not that is true, which you also were saying that you had, but then you actually took that next step that most people don't and tried to actually go and see, is there data to either verify or to disprove these claims, right? And so you did that.
Yeah, and I realized that those claims were absolutely bogus. They were not based on facts at all. Mm-hmm. They were probably based on feelings. I was watching this, and it's anecdotal evidence, of course, I understand, but I was watching this video on YouTube, and they were asking people, like, how many black Americans do you think police officers kill? Unarmed black Americans do you think police officers kill every year in the United States? People were giving outrageous numbers, like...
Yeah, like thousands.
Yeah.
Tens of thousands.
Yeah, like 2,000, 1,000. It's like, where are you getting these numbers from? Is it all perception based on the content that you consume every day on social media? Mm-hmm. Because there's no other way to explain it. If you look at the numbers, we're talking like, you know, like...
Well, wasn't it like 2019?
It was like nine...
The number was 14 or something?
Yeah.
Whereas the number for unarmed white citizens that were killed by police was like 25.
Now, by the way, the definition of unarmed includes a person sitting in his car with the gun next to him on the passenger side. I think that falls under the definition of unarmed.
I saw that. Yeah.
Right? So when you're talking about the United States in particular, it's a different world altogether, because every time a police officer pulls over anybody, they have to assume that that individual is armed. And that's what a lot of people, especially in Canada, don't understand, is that this potential threat is there at all times. Because anybody you pull over in America can be armed. Anybody. So you never know. That's why, you know, they have to keep their finger on the trigger.
Yeah.
You know?
Or just be ready for anything.
Yeah.
Like, their threat perception level is extremely high because it has to be. It's the same as, it's an evolutionary development with human psychology in general, is that all of us are descendant from ancestors who thought when the grass rustled or a stick broke that it wasn't just the wind, or it wasn't a harmless other animal or another ape walking through the forest. It's always a tiger, and that's how you survive, because the ones that didn't think like that and act like that are the ones that got eaten by the tigers.
Yeah.
Basically. So it's like the evolutionary history of our species is to assume that it's the worst case scenario so that you can be prepared for it, basically. And so the same goes for police. Like, most people don't understand how dangerous police like jobs actually are, or can be, and can turn into at a split second.
Oh, I've seen plenty of those videos on YouTube where seemingly harmless incidents turn violent in 1 second. And that's when police officers die in the line of duty, and it's tragic. And every year, I think around at least 50 police officers die in America.
Which is increasing. Like I just read something the other day and this is also part of what we're going to get into talking more about how these ideas and these narratives are incredibly dangerous for our society, and they're sending us further into a chaotic environment where people don't trust each other and where people are more prone to violence, which these stories and these narratives are actually adding to. They're actually increasing. And I just read something the other day about how I think in America especially, but there are some recent killings of cops where they have been intentionally lured into a situation and ambushed with the sole purpose of luring them there to kill them. And it's incredibly messed up because it's like it's this indiscriminate killing of human beings that have nothing to do with anything that these people are choosing to kill these innocent cops for, unless of course you believe some of the narratives that have come along with the racial uprising and these narratives being pushed in the media, and this idea of like ACAB, like all cops are bastards, every single one of them. And I guess something I'm interested to hear your thoughts on as well, because we don't have to get too into the statistics. I think I might still go into a little bit more of the statistics for clarity on that when I sort of intro the interview, but I just lost it. That happens sometimes. That's okay though.
That's okay.
I guess no. What I was getting at is, obviously a lot of what comes along with the narrative. There is a lot of truth to a lot of almost like every contentious issue on both sides. There's always a lot of truth, or there's always at least a kernel of very important truths that are coming alongside a lot of what might be classified as mis or disinformation, or just a general misunderstanding of the facts of the reality. And of course, the reason that Black and racialized communities in America have higher levels of violence and are over policed, and so they see these incidents of police violence of which which you pointed out in the article, it's not just about the killing of unarmed or armed criminals, whatever their race might be, but also that the statistics do actually bear out that the Black community and racialized communities do actually see an increase compared to white people with interactions with the police, and that may turn into some type of violence that isn't lethal, and that the history of America and slavery and segregation and redlining communities and not giving them access to bank loans and good education, because the education, the schools are often funded by taxpayer or by homeowner taxes, and that there are these like systems of oppression and injustice and stuff. So it's like all of that stuff comes along with the conversation as well, of course. But let's not get too deep into the statistics, because what happened to you though was that, okay, so you decided to investigate it, you decided to write this article to say sort of like, hey, like this is what the actual statistics say about this specific thing that is being claimed that actually isn't true. And so what were you doing at the time with because you were volunteering for what was it, and you had mentioned that because you wrote this article you were then fired.
Well, let me clarify. So at the time, I was volunteering for two organizations. One was Futurepreneur Canada. The other one was the Hub at UTSC. It's an incubator for startups, and it all started with a comment on Instagram. I made a comment. I think it was a protest here in Toronto. BlogTO posted a video about it. People raising their hands, saying "Don't shoot, don't shoot," and I left a comment citing FBI statistics. Because it seemed like a one-sided narrative to me that had nothing to do with reality. And it turns out a stranger on the internet did not like my comment.
Good old internet strangers.
She researched me. She found out who I am.
Oh, she hunted you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. She found me on LinkedIn, and she found out where I was volunteering at the time. Contacted both organizations, citing my unacceptable bigoted views, and how dare you employ bigots as volunteers. Anyway, so the Hub got rid of me right away.
Right, but they bought it, which is the craziest thing too.
Yeah, they were like a complete stranger on the internet wrote them and said, "I'm offended, so get rid of this person." The Hub got rid of me right away, citing some kind of violation of their diversity, equity, and inclusion policy, without specifying.
Of course.
How did I violate it?
Yeah, like what is exactly? Yeah. What part of it was the violation in the policy, and how did anything I did how did that actually violate this policy? And it seems that a lot of the stories that we're hearing with these types of things is that those are never provided, or if they are provided at all, they're often so vague that it can't possibly make sense.
Yeah. I was like, okay, it was a volunteer position. I was volunteering my time. If you guys don't want me, that's your problem. Futurepreneur took a slightly different approach. They hopped on a call with me to discuss my comments. Basically, they were not able to articulate what is it that I said or did that was wrong. The point of the conversation was, you are a representative of Futurepreneur, which in my opinion is total BS, because I was expressing a personal opinion on social media, but to them, I was, representing Futurepreneur. And essentially they told me to shut up. They told me to be mindful next time you express your views on social media. Of course, I didn't promise anything because I think it's unacceptable that you police people's views and, this sense of entitlement that, you are representing us. No, I don't.
In every facet of your breathing, waking life.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything you think or utter is a representation of your connection to your work or place you're volunteering or what have you.
Yeah.
And it's so bizarre because you know how we run through, scenarios through our head and stuff. I think about that because of some of the things I share, if something like this were to happen to me and my work were to try to talk to me about it, discipline me for it, or let me go for it. Luckily, I'm unionized where I work, and so I know I can't actually even be talked to about anything or disciplined about anything unless if I choose to have a union rep present, so that there's somebody there, so it's not just my word against the management or the company. And like, my two direct managers are really cool. They really like me. I really like them. But if something were to happen where someone were to find out where I work and make a complaint, and they were to talk to me about it, just like you're saying, like, when I run through this possible scenario happening in my head, it makes me incredibly angry, first of all, and incredibly frustrated that this is happening in general, but it's also happening to so many people, and there's so many stories of this kind of thing happening, and people being fired from their work. And it's tragic, really, especially in cases where it's like, you know, it could be one comment that some stranger, or, you know, even if it's someone you work with or someone you know, if they didn't like it, and then they're able to somehow get you fired from your workplace. You might have kids. Even if you don't, you suddenly don't have an income to live and feed yourself. Like, and these people think that that's in any way, shape, or form a reasonable or appropriate response to some opinion, whether it's political or not, something you decided to say or share publicly online, that is justifiable grounds to remove you from your place of employment, especially when it's like, you know, it's outside of work, you're not on the clock, you're not engaging in any capacity in any like environment that is actually related to your workplace at all or your duties at all, and that's a possibility that could happen. When I think about any possibility of that happening to me, it just gets me so upset and angry so like quickly that in my mind I'm like, if anyone tries to pull that shit on me, I'm gonna be immediately like, first of all, I'm gonna get a union rep so that they're here, and I'm gonna tell you straight up, if you think that you have any right whatsoever to take something that I said on Facebook or Instagram or anywhere or in person that I didn't say to anyone I work with, I'm not even friends with anybody on social media that I work with, partially for this reason, because I'm just like, just don't mix it, but also just being like, if you believe you have any right, legally or otherwise, to even talk to me about this, which is ridiculous, let alone discipline me for it, or if you think you're going to let me go because of it, then I'm going to sue your company. There's plenty of lawyers that will take these cases on pro bono on the grounds that you don't pay anything unless you win, because a lot of people would be like, oh yeah, we're going to win this. And I just would fight it so intensely, because it's like, that's one of the things that our society is lacking. And like, for people to have the courage to stand up and speak up against some of these narratives that are going on that aren't borne out, they're not supported by facts, and then the cowardice of the employers, of the managers and the companies themselves, whoever's making those types of decisions, it's unconscionable, or unconscionable. Is that how you say that?
I think so, yeah.
But go on. Okay, so this happened.
But it gets better. It gets better.
It gets better.
So get this. So I forgot to mention that individual recruited. I don't even know whether she was her friend or not. She recruited another person who was a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant to contact Futurepreneur. That was the person who initially contacted Futurepreneur. She then contacted me this consultant contacted me on LinkedIn, and she was very sneaky about it. She said she was writing an article on Futurepreneur. She wanted to ask me some questions.
Oh, gosh.
And then she started asking me questions about my article that I... No. Or did she want my comment on what I wrote on Instagram? Doesn't matter. She wanted to engage in a smear campaign.
Mm-hmm. Paint you as a villain.
Yeah, paint me as this bigot who volunteers for Futurepreneur. And I refused to answer any questions unrelated to Futurepreneur. She was probably like, damn, didn't work. So when Futurepreneur initially decided to do nothing, right, after having that phone conversation with me, that's when that individual, the original one, that girl who complained to UTSC about me, she got really mad. She was like, how is it
you
that
didn't
you didn't fire him?
Because I complained.
Are you serious? He's still volunteering for you? So she got mad and she started writing an article on Medium about this bigoted person who volunteers for Futurepreneur, and the sole audience, the sole recipient of that message was the CEO of Futurepreneur, the woman who runs Futurepreneur. But I'm not sure if that article got to her, because they caught wind of the Medium article that I wrote about police in America. Mm-hmm. And that other consultant probably forwarded to them. So like, see, now you should definitely fire him because he just expressed unacceptable views on Medium. So that's when they emailed me and they said, well, in light of this article that you wrote on Medium, you are pretty much now definitely fired because you clearly violated our diversity.
The DEI policy.
How? They didn't specify. Of course. So that was, in many ways, an eye-opening experience for me as an immigrant. Entrepreneur is so part of my identity now, so I use it everywhere. As an immigrant, because I come from a country where there is no freedom of speech, where nowadays people go to jail for a tweet or a comment on Facebook. So this was in many ways personal for me, because I don't want Canada to be like Russia. I don't want people to be prosecuted for their
thought crimes.
Thought crimes, yeah. It seemed very odd. I suddenly had more free time because I was no longer coaching futurepreneurs, entrepreneurs, and at the time I was coaching 2 brilliant female entrepreneurs, and I hope they, grow their businesses and become successful, because they're smart and driven, and I really enjoyed coaching them. But, it's their loss if they want to enforce these silly policies because someone on the internet got offended. It's their choice. It's their choice. If these people believe in what they're doing, if they think that this is the righteous thing to do, then I don't want to be part of that organization because I don't share those values. I think if you are offended, if you disagree with someone, then engage in a dialogue. If you're offended, who cares? Screw this. Nobody cares. But if you think I am incorrect, if I'm presenting an argument that is not based in facts, that is completely ridiculous, then explain to me how is it that I'm wrong. Prove me wrong. I'm the kind of person who I would like to think that I have an open mind. And if I'm wrong, then if you can persuade me that this other point of view is correct and this is the truth and not what you believe in, I'm open to changing my mind. I'm not set in my ways. And I think it's a dangerous pitfall that a lot of people end up in, is when their views calcify. Mm-hmm. And they become so convinced that what they believe is correct, and they fail to see that there are other perspectives and other, valid perspectives. A lot of times, two different perspectives can be correct.
Mm-hmm. That's like, people don't seem to understand that actually is the way that the world is in many respects, that often two very contradictory things that seem like they, shouldn't be able to exist at the same time and both be correct, and maybe not wholly correct, but it's like everything always has some truth. And it's where the gray area is, where the nuance is, where where is, like, if it's, everything tends to get positioned as being on one side or the other, but it's usually that, well, there's actually truths on both sides, and there are things that are misunderstood or misrepresented on both sides, particularly by the other side, but that's the complexity of the world. But when people get, self-righteous about their beliefs, and they get ideological, and they get tribal, and they get into this black and white way of thinking, it's incredibly dangerous. And people don't have any real conception of coming from a society like you. Like, you shared with me the Trigonometry podcast, which I recently told you I really appreciated, because one of the hosts is also Russian born, and then he grew up for the first, I think, like 12 years or something like that of his life in Russia, and then he immigrated to the UK, where he's been for the last 20 years or so. And you listen to accounts of people who actually know from experience what it's like to grow up in an authoritarian, totalitarian society where you don't have the freedom to express your views, you don't have freedom of speech, we think that the treatment of citizens, whatever their race is bad now. Wait until you devolve our society and the social norms and the institutions in our society, which we are seeing eroded at alarming rates. Like, wait until, like, that's the society that we actually live in. And it's like, you hear, like you're saying, like Konstantin says, and so many people, like Dr. Gad Saad, he's a Lebanese Jew who grew up in Lebanon as a Jew. So the people in the Middle East who hate Jews, like, that is like a violent, unstable society that he escaped from, and then became an evolutionary psychologist. And he knows, and he talks about how when you play the identity politics game and you start pitting citizens against each other into ideological groups or camps or tribes, then we either, and I just wrote about this on a story I posted the other day, it's like, we either figure out how to have dialogue and debate and finding common ground, rather than like fighting each other and straw manning the easiest parts from the other side's argument, so to speak, to attack and make them look like ridiculous evil people, which is happening on both sides of the spectrum. Then if we don't figure out how to have those debates, even if they're people intensely disagreeing with each other, it's like we figure out how to do that now while we still can, or we march further and further towards a more unstable and a more tribal society that is much more likely to much more easily erupt into real violence. You know, this whole idea about words are violence and speech is violence and stuff. It's like speech can be used to incite violence for sure. That's why hate speech is illegal. But speech itself isn't violence, particularly simply because it, you know, challenges your beliefs and the things that you think. And yeah, we're just like, we're in a really dangerous place. And here, I'm just gonna... Okay, so recording again. But yeah, so continue on though, you know, it's like this is the situation that we're finding ourselves in increasingly.
We are putting feelings of infantile individuals up on a pedestal.
Mm-hmm.
We're not engaged in a dialogue. We're in this game of protecting people's feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And this is detrimental to our democracy. This is detrimental to a shared sense of identity. Because when I think of identity, I think of me as a citizen, right? For example, what does it mean to be a Canadian citizen? Well, to me it means sharing certain values that you believe in. And in a lot of cases, that's the reason why immigrants come to this country.
Mm-hmm.
Because they share those values and they want to live in a country that practices those values.
Why? Because they don't have those values in the societies that they're coming from.
Precisely.
That's why they're fleeing.
Precisely.
You know, they're fleeing ideological persecution and violence, real violence,
Mm-hmm.
not, you know,
Mm-hmm.
sticks and stones violence.
But identitarians, that's what I call them, they want to split us into subjective identity-based groups, right? With terminology like cisgendered white males and all that stuff.
Holla!
This is not helpful, like at all, to a goal of creating a healthy society. Because if you think about it, like, why are we here? What are we doing? Like, what's the point of everything that we're doing? In my subjective opinion, the point is to create a...
It's all for likes, man. It's all for the likes.
You clearly don't get it. Subscribers is where it's at, man.
Yeah. Oh, shit. That's where the likes come from.
Like, you know, I could be wrong, of course, but I would imagine that we're doing what we're doing in order to create a healthy and prosperous society where as many of us can not just be successful, but have our basic needs covered. We shouldn't have to worry about how to put food on the table. We have the technology to do these things. We have the intellect, collective intellect, to achieve all those things. And yet we are mired in identity politics and misgendering people and things that do not take us forward as a society. We need to be focused on system level change. Mm-hmm. And how do we achieve change? Because it's incredibly difficult given the entrenched business interests and the way our society operates. Is it possible? Is it doable? Yes, but it's very difficult and challenging. And the more we continue being mired in these conversations about identity and what is a man, what is a woman, we're not going to move forward, in my subjective opinion. I'm all for respecting every single human being, because I happen to subscribe to this notion, this theory, that we're all one, essentially. We're all one. We're all manifestations of source energy, source consciousness,
whatever you
experiencing
want to call it.
itself.
The universe,
Right.
God. People like to use different names, or they're comfortable with, using only certain names, but it's...
That's why I see every other human being as equal to me, regardless of their wealth and any other factors. Every single individual, in my opinion, is equal to me. I was raised to treat, the janitor and the CEO of the company exactly the same, right? And now, having undergone certain transformational experiences, I'm able to put it into words and better articulate things, because I've experienced those things. So I definitely and firmly believe that we're all one. We're all we pretend that we're all separate, right? Because we have physical bodies and we perceive each other as separate individuals. But at the end of the day, we're one. We will realize it, because a lot of us are at different levels of consciousness, but eventually we will realize it. We as a collective society, will come to this realization. The sooner the better.
Hopefully.
The sooner the better.
We hope so, if we don't fucking blow ourselves up, which could happen anytime now. I guess, something I want to talk about, kind of coming to wrap the conversation up a little bit, is it seems like anybody who might listen to this episode who is already more aligned with our way of thinking, that we clearly agree on a lot of stuff. It may seem like this conversation is, just an echo chamber of us, kind of self-flatulation, that we're just, I agree with you, you agree with me, good, we're on the right side of history. And I guess, just like you're saying, it's we're all one, and a lot of people talk about how, this divide and conquer way of ruling people has been around forever. And the idea that, the media is used by a tool of the elite, however conspiratorial you want to get. We could, maybe another conversation, go deeper down that rabbit hole. But the idea that it's we're being pitted against each other, because if we're fighting each other, then we're not unifying, and then we are not looking at the real problems going on in society and the real perpetrators, when most of the quote unquote sides of these contentious issues in our society, in these debates that are going on, everyone thinks that they're on the right side, and the people who disagree with them, that are on the so-called other side, are the ones that are on the wrong side of history. And I guess, what do you think, or how would you respond to the need to be able to strongman the other side's kind of stance that they have? Or how do we try to understand each other? How do we try to communicate in better ways that aren't so incendiary toward one another? How do we recognize that actually so many of the things that everybody wants are the same, but we think that the problems are due to different things, and the ways about finding solutions to the things that we all ultimately want, safe, stable, just societies? It's how do we how do we be better at communicating with the people in our lives that might disagree with us?
I'll start with the word sandwich.
Yes.
So I found it fascinating that in the corporate world, they use the sandwich methodology to provide feedback to people, because it was kind of new to me. Because in my subjective opinion, if you don't like something, if I did something wrong, then tell me, look, Andre, this is what you did wrong. This is like not cool. You know, do it differently. Or like, this was really stupid. Like, cut it out. Don't do it again. This is how you do it. But no, here, because we care about people's
people
feelings.
Don't respond well to that, though, right? That's
so you
why
gotta say something
I've heard
nice.
Of this.
It's true. You gotta say something nice. Oh, well, you did something right here, but here, you know, we need to work on this here.
Or it's like,
right?
always give 2 positive feedback before you give a criticism.
Exactly. And then you finish off with, oh yeah, and then you did something really nice here. You know, good job. But don't forget what I said, you know, in the middle, you know.
Right.
So
okay, so it's positive, critical, or constructive feedback, positive.
the point is that when you disagree with someone, I think it's important to find or establish common ground, okay? So let's say, and I use it a lot, unfortunately, on Facebook when I comment on people's articles. I'm not supposed to, because you can't change people's minds.
No,
but
it's such a waste of time.
It is, and my wife tells me the same. But, you know.
I did that for years.
Oh, I wrote like really long comments.
Yeah. Well, I first got interested in politics and social issues after the global financial collapse, and that was sort of my real political awakening, and that was when I was in my early 20s, and I was, you know, awake before woke was a thing, and I was trying to, you know, wake other people up to the problems that were going on in our society and in our world, and the injustice and the corruption and the political debates on Facebook. It's like I find that this is what happens online in general. It's what's happening in I feel like, at least on Facebook, commenting on Facebook tended to be, especially, you know, 10, 15 years ago, a place where you could actually at least attempt to have much more of a dialogue than the world we live in now, where attention spans are much worse. I, you know, see that for myself, for pretty much everybody. Like, can relate to that. And, you know, the 24-hour story, and the, you know, like, Instagram's not a place to have conversations, like, at all. And but even when on Facebook, when it was a bit more geared for that, it's like we say our points, we lay them out as if it's an Oxford debate, try to be really critical, really rational, really logical, back it up with proof, with facts, with articles, with citations where our opinions are coming from, that they're not our opinions. These are actually based on, you know, this renowned expert in this topic and whatnot. And then people will just disregard every single thing you said, even though you just picked apart their argument piece by piece with proof, and then they'll just say the exact same thing again. Like, it's just like in one ear and right out the other. And now in the environment that we're in, it's like it's happening in a much more shallow and volatile way, essentially. Right?
It is true. Unfortunately, it's true. So my philosophy is that if you confront somebody and say, "Oh, you're stupid, you're wrong," like it's like you're clearly false. You know, here is how things actually are, and here are the stats. Blah blah blah. They will shut down. Mm-hmm. They will completely shut down. They will not engage with you. They will not be receptive to your message. And so, at the end of the day, you're not going to change their mind.
No.
So the way that I would approach it is, you need to establish some kind of common ground. So what does that mean? You would say, look, I understand where you're coming from, And I agree with you when it comes to A and B. But I think when it comes to X and Y, I think you're incorrect because, well, the data says, ABC or there are multiple studies that prove that, blah, blah, blah. That way, the individual feel valued, right? They will understand that you value their opinions, you value them as a person, and your goal is not to engage in a cheap ad hominem, but to try to change their mind. And if they are open to changing their mind on whatever topic, well, maybe you'll be lucky. But it's incredibly difficult in the current climate because that's not how humans communicate. That's not how we talk to each other. A lot of times we smear the other.
People are just trying to destroy each other these days. It's like people don't actually want to engage in dialogue, to listen or learn or understand. They're just trying to find ways to pick apart that person with a straw man, making their argument ridiculous in the easiest way they can and then tearing that down instead of actually trying to engage with the substance of what they're actually putting forth or attacking them personally with an ad hominem. And it's unfortunate because I get wrapped up into this myself. It happens to the best of us, and I find myself too. It's really challenging with the environment we find ourselves in because there's so many issues, there's so many crises, it's so contentious that I think the whole world is going absolutely fucking insane, in a lot of respects. And so I find it to be incredibly hard to not get emotionally hijacked. And even this past week, it's happened to me a couple times where I've got into political disagreements with my brother. It happened with a few days ago, and I just got totally emotionally hijacked, and I was actually a fucking asshole to him. And it was like I was belittling him because it's like, well, I know how interested I am in these things and how much time and effort I put into listening to world-renowned experts on X, Y, and Z topic, and then when we're talking about these topics, it's like he might have heard a tiny little snippet on the news, if anything, and then he's engaging with me as if this is a simple difference of opinion. And I know that, outside of work and raising a family, and he still likes to play video games and watch and play sports, and that's great. I'm happy for him that he's living his life in a way that he's doing well. I'm really happy for him about that. But then when we get into this political disagreement where I'm like, what you're saying is wrong, and I know that you don't actively take an interest in these things, and I do, and what I'm saying is correct because it's based on the opinions of the actual experts. And it led to me really kind of being an asshole to him and belittling him. And he was so upset with me, and I ended up luckily for me, I am able to, once I'm out of that space of being emotionally hijacked and being a fucking asshole and reacting from emotion rather than responding in a more appropriate way, I am able to have the humility to go, fuck, I was wrong. I have to say sorry. It's the right thing to do. I have to actually own up to where I made a mistake or where I acted in a way that ultimately isn't aligned with my values or isn't aligned with my own goals, of how do we actually talk to each other? How do we actually find common ground? How do we actually figure out what objectives we have in common that we want to actually solve problems? and then go about doing that instead of just trying to destroy the other person and be right and stuff like that.
I think
right?
we forget a lot of times that people come from different places. People come from different points of view because they gather information from different places. We a lot of times assume that because I think a certain way, right, the other individual probably thinks the same. We assume that
One
they
of the
have
biggest mistakes humans make
right?
is assuming that other
Right?
people think like you do.
Because you assume they have access to the same information, to the same sources, they have the same critical thinking capacity. They probably, you think they share your views or your values, which they might not. We make all of these assumptions, and then we get surprised when people disagree or have a different opinion. So one way to understand the other person is to first start off with, what's the common ground? Is there anything that we agree on? Like anything. Doesn't matter how tiny it is. Once you establish that common ground, you can start exploring. You can start asking questions. So why is it that you think this way? What led you to believe that whatever you believe in? What is it based on? Right? And then you can try to find common ground by trying to understand the validity of the different sources, right?
Which seems to be next to impossible these days.
Oh, it's
which is like, it's nice in theory. Like, that sounds great if only it were remotely possible. Which I'm finding to be one of the hardest things the past few years. It's like, no matter what the issue is, it seems like, and I have always made a point of really honestly trying to seek out information to prove or disprove my beliefs or what I think about an issue, especially when they're so clearly contentious and clearly like people on different sides and fighting, to try to understand, okay, well, what's actually going on here and where's the evidence to prove it one way or the other, so that I know that my beliefs are based on like a really honest attempt to actually understand the landscape of the issue, where both sides are coming from, the evidence that they're basing their opinions and their beliefs on, and the arguments that they're making. And I found when it was about things like, the safety of vaccines and anti-vax and autism and climate change and the doubt sowed by the oil companies and the PR companies sowing doubt in the public and on the science and stuff, I felt like years ago I was able to sort of investigate those issues and actually parse out that there was actually a scientific basis for believing one way or the other, essentially. And then the last few years has seemed like, and there is evidence that we really are embedded in a information war right now. It's like people have no idea, really. I think generally speaking, we didn't get taught much about how the real world really works. People don't know much about history of the world. They don't know much about other societies that they didn't grow up in, particularly more truly authoritarian societies like Russia and so many other places. And I lost it again. I used to smoke a lot of weed. I haven't been recently. I've been doing Sober October, but my mind slips me sometimes.
That's okay.
But I don't know. I think it used to be easier to actually try to do your own research and have sources of information that were trustworthy to more people, rather than the different camps on each side of any issue feeling like they have legitimate, trustworthy scientific evidence and experts on their side that prove their side, and then just disregarding what the other side says. And what I was actually saying was that, like, we are in a war. We're in a war. We're in an ideological war and an information war, and people don't understand about the history of wars, what happens during wars, and the fact that, like, we're not in a kinetic war where people are boots on the ground, tanks on the ground. We're not. You know, there is one happening that we are seemingly more and more likely to get pulled into, and it truly turning into like a World War III scenario, which it ultimately it is. It's a proxy World War III right now. But when that's taking place, it's like information wars are going on all the time. People are constantly trying to do cyber warfare. They're trying, you know, it's like China and Russia are sowing seeds of doubt, and this is at like the level of, you know, the intelligence agencies, like, you know, the CIA and the FBI, and in Canada CSIS and stuff, like the equivalent institutions in places like China and Russia and certain countries in the Middle East. They are engaged in warfare that isn't shooting bullets at each other. It's shooting disinformation, misinformation, trying to hack into and ruin our energy infrastructure, our banks, our companies, all sorts of stuff. And that's been going on forever. But over the past 2.5 years, we have seen the sort of fruits of that type of activity playing out in our society at a greater and greater scale. And it's just,
I don't think we need the Russians and the Chinese to misinform us when
we're doing it
the media
ourselves.
is already controlled by a handful of corporations, and their goal is not to inform the populace.
No.
Their goal is to control the populace. What we're starting to see is that as we are transitioning into a higher state of consciousness, and I realize some people don't subscribe to this idea. It's all woo-woo.
Well,
And
even just that terminology, it's like we are clearly, and it's something that would be, I think, argued against less, to say that more and more people are, you know, waking up, so to speak. They're becoming more aware of that the world isn't this corporate fantasy that we grew up in, where everything's just normal and safe and modern, and we're smarter and we're better. We're not subject to the same types of psychological issues that humanity has dealt with forever, with the types of people who are in control of institutions and power. It's like we have the freedom to do whatever we want, whenever we want, and not give a fuck about anything that has to do with the real world, because we've been insulated in this fantasy world. And, you know, even before the war in Russia and Ukraine started, I listened to the Monk Debates podcast every week. It's called Friday Focus, and Rudyard, who's the executive director of the Monk Debates and the podcast and the dialogues, has a 30 to 40 minute dialogue with Janice Gross-Stein, who's the founding director of the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and they talk about one or two things in the news, the biggest issues in the week, which is, these days they're like, we have too many, there's way too many things to talk about. Like, we're just being constantly bombarded with these, like, really existential things going on in the world, and it's just, everything is so complex and it's so polarized, and it's honestly, it's terrifying. But that's part of the reason I listen to that kind of stuff, is that I'm trying to, like, understand, like, what is the actual world that we're living in, and like what are we gonna do about it? How do we like prepare? How do we actually speak to each other and try to fix these issues and stuff? And one of the things they said when the global financial collapse happened, it's like, or not the global financial collapse, sorry, the when the Russia-Ukraine war happened, they were like, the past 30 years was the exception to the rule, and the rule of constant wars in Europe and the world wars that happened and the just constant wars throughout history. It's like the last 30 years was an exceptionally peaceful and prosperous time where the what do they call it, like the great power politics in the world were sort of on pause the last 30 years because the end of the USSR, the end of the Cold War, it seemed like the West and capitalism really won out against the East and communism against Russia, now Russia and China. And so Russia was so sort of like chopped down after that, and China was just kind of on the rise the last 30 years, the last 15 to 20 in particular, and that it's like the world that we lived in for the last 30 years is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. We're back to the world of great power politics and more open destabilization, and it's like this is what we're dealing with now. This is why I want to like have conversations like this and listen to the things I'm listening to, because I'm like, I feel like I find it to be super interesting, because I've been saying for so many years that like the things that are going on in the real world are infinitely more interesting than the shows we watch and the stories we tell and the movies and the books we read and the Game of Thrones and the espionage films and all this shit. But people love that stuff because it really is based on the true history of like our species and the insanity that we engage in. And I'm like, the real world and what's going on is infinitely more interesting than that stuff. But I feel like people haven't paid attention to it, certainly not en masse, because it's like it's been too slow. It's been boring essentially and too slow. But the last couple of years, it's been accelerating. It's been getting more in your face. And so to kind of go back to what you were saying, it's like it's not, you know, if people don't like that idea or the framing of that, like we're moving into a higher level of consciousness, it's like we are moving into a greater awareness that we have to deal with the reality of the problems that we're faced with of which there are many. They're very serious, they're incredibly dangerous, and if we don't figure out ways to engage with each other in respectful dialogue, even if it gets heated and even if it gets intensely like contentious and we disagree with one another, it's like if we can't like learn to do that with each other, with the people we disagree with, then yeah, like just like the destabilized countries in the Middle East and Africa and elsewhere, that we see true civil war and constant violence and no stability in their politics, with their civil infrastructure, less corruption, less overt corruption, all that kind of stuff. It's like we're fucked.
I'm slightly more optimistic.
Bring us back up.
I'm slightly more optimistic because I do happen to subscribe to the idea that we are moving from what I call 3D consciousness to 5D consciousness. Mm-hmm. But it's important to understand it does not automatically imply that it's going to be, you know, rainbows and unicorns all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's not. There's never going to be a utopia.
Well,
unlikely.
Let's see if we can achieve. How close can we get?
We could, Well,
to,
it's like any of the problems we do solve. The history of the world is that we always create new problems with.
We have a lot of
everything
problems
we solve, but
like
we certainly, if not a utopia, we could get into a much better place than we currently find ourselves in.
Most definitely, and it will most likely require a different approach. Right now, we're engaged in incremental changes in our society. I happen to believe that we will require system-level change at some point when it comes to how we are governed, when it comes to the education system, finances, money, jobs, like all of those things. It is difficult to imagine a different world because right now we have so many different problems. Like if you look at the world at the moment, like I'm not sure if we're on the brink of World War III. We are. It's definitely very concerning how this situation in Ukraine can escalate, depending on China's actions, our neighbors to the south, the EU, and NATO. There's a lot of moving parts at the moment. I do not think we're going to get to any sort of nuclear war.
I hope not.
I don't think so. Even though it is true that there are hawks in Moscow, just like there are hawks at the Pentagon in the United States, and maybe within the Biden administration, who believe that Putin's approach is not sufficient enough. He's being soft. So those individuals, they are hardliners, and if they were to come to power, they would escalate this war. So it remains to be seen how things will play out in Ukraine, and whether it will truly morph into World War III. I think one of the possibilities where it can get to that level is, not sure if I want to say if or when at this point, probably when China attacks Taiwan, right? Because the United States have expressed a clear intent to protect Taiwan, supply Taiwan with weapons.
They've called it like making them a porcupine in the region with the new weapons that they're sending them, and the Biden administration just collapsed the Chinese computer chip industry.
It would definitely have a significant ripple effect around the world, because Taiwan is a leading manufacturer of microchips, and those things are used everywhere, in cars and weapons, like everywhere. Everything.
That's why the U.S. just like sanctioned China, and they basically they just collapsed their entire industry to make it so that they're like, we will not let you become the leaders in AI and quantum computing and stuff, because whoever ends up leading that is going to have a much better chance of being, the top world power for the next potentially 100 years if we, don't blow ourselves up. But
yeah, China considers Taiwan its territory.
Oh yeah,
and they will protect it through whatever means possible. And what that means is we're likely to see a hot war between China and the United States. It's not going to be a proxy war in Taiwan. If China were to invade Taiwan, the Americans will protect Taiwan, and if that happens, that's going to have a serious impact on commerce, food security. It's going to have a massive ripple effect around the world. World currencies will be impacted. The impact is going to be significant, in some ways unpredictable, in some ways predictable. I'm hopeful that we don't get to that point.
Yeah, well, a lot of people are talking about that. That's most likely to happen if the war with Russia first escalates into a hot war between the US and NATO and Russia rather than a proxy war, then there will be this cascade of, okay, well, the US can't fight two great powers at the same time, so now might be the time to take back Taiwan, potentially some other smaller regions or island kind of like regions, and that the threat that we're under right now, if this escalates, is that a whole bunch of other regions in the world that are currently more stable because of the way the world has been will see that as an opportunity to then go do what Russia essentially did, is, you know, be opportunistic and just go and take what they want, which is sort of the history of the world, right? Yeah.
It's definitely possible, but at the same time, I think the conflict in Ukraine can be contained. Putin is not Stalin. He has, you know, his plan does not include taking over Germany and Spain and the rest of Europe to establish a Soviet Union 2.0. That's just not going to happen. NATO will stop Russian troops if that were to happen. So I don't see that conflict spilling over. It's just going to drag into 2023, possibly 2024. A lot of Russian soldiers will die, unfortunately. It's pretty clear as it is. So maybe caskets with bodies will change people's minds in Russia. I don't know, but it is an inevitability that more people will die on the Russian side and on the Ukrainian side as well.
I forget what the stats are, but one of the conversations I heard recently talking about the death stats of like World War II, where that, you know, it might have been like a few 100,000 or like a few million soldiers kind of on the American and the West side died, but just like an exponentially higher number of Russian, mostly, like, you know, call them soldiers, but mostly really they're just civilians. And I forget what the type of, they called it like a type of war, like there's a name for it, where essentially they're just throwing bodies at a line essentially that they're protecting. And
due to mismanagement, due to NKVD's strategy of shooting any Russian or Soviet soldier who wanted to retreat. You could not retreat. You'd be shot by the NKVD, who are right behind you. And unfortunately, it's being practiced today in Ukraine. Some individuals reported, you know, that their fellow soldiers were shot in the back when they tried to retreat. So this tactic is being used in 2022, unfortunately. But it was used heavily during World War II by the NKVD. Yeah.
We really took a deep dive into the fucking Russian-Ukraine conflict here. Yeah, I guess we can just sort of like pin that. That happens sometimes. I definitely, I do have a somewhat pessimistic view or a negative outlook, and I'm more prone to, like, I've struggled with depression and anxiety a lot in my life, and so my sort of baseline of my mood tends to be a little bit lower than I would like it to be, and that makes it a little bit more difficult to kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel or the silver lining or those types of things. But I think something that I've been really present to throughout the last couple years as things continue to get crazier and crazier on so many different axes is that, you know, when I was in my early 20s, when the global financial collapse happened, and part of why that was my political awakening in a large way then was because it was like, you know, the media across the world was screaming apocalypse, and I was like, I just had this question that really sent me down the rabbit hole. It sent me on this journey that, well, like, who's in power? Who's making decisions? How did we get here? Like, isn't it many people's jobs specifically to make sure that these types of things don't happen? And that question can really be used in today's environment as well, because in the context of the global financial collapse, it was like largely driven by the banks and the mismanagement of the debt that people had taken on with the housing bubble that collapsed, that burst and led to the, you know, domino effect that put the entire world economy into jeopardy. And unfortunately, we didn't learn the lessons we needed to. Nobody who was really responsible for that happening really got in any trouble. The banks got bailed out, and so it's like the people pay doubly, and that's kind of the way that the world is set up in a lot of ways. And now we find ourselves in a situation where things are much worse. They're much more complex, with many more issues that are much more prominent and existential in their nature. And back then, when I was having these sort of Oxford style debates with people on Facebook and trying to wake people up, so to speak, there was this deep desire to understand and try to contribute in some positive way to solving the problems that we're faced with. But those problems weren't bad enough, that people were much more easily able to go back into the fantasy world that we grew up in. And something that I am optimistic about in sort of a counterintuitive way now is that things are so bad and they're so crazy and they're so fucked up on so many different levels, and people are waking up at a much greater degree. We are becoming much more aware that, oh fuck, like that world that we thought we grew up in actually like either wasn't the real world or it's not the real world anymore. And so, you know, it's always great times of crisis that provide the best and like realist opportunity for actually solving some of the problems that we're faced with. So there's a little bit of optimism in there somewhere.
We were born into a system of economic servitude, the Matrix. We, once again, this is something I just happen to subscribe to. Maybe some people will say you're nuts, you're crazy, but we picked this reality in this lifetime. It was our decision.
Do you have this room booked?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll be done in a minute.
Okay.
And so we were born into a system of economic servitude, but we picked this lifetime. And yes, you know, in the States, you've got Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Farm, who are really in control. It's not political leaders who are in control, it's corporations. Mm-hmm. Because corporations control resources.
And militaries. It's like, you know, there are military leaders who are unelected, who have been in their positions for years and years. They don't have term limits. And this is a fact that the President of the United States doesn't even get security clearance for certain things because everything's on a need-to-know basis. And even the president doesn't need to know some things, right?
The entire history of the United States is overthrowing regimes, democratically elected, not democratically elected, doesn't matter, to protect the interests of the United States, which is code word for the interests of corporations, American corporations. So that's the reality. What can we do? Well, I probably can't do much about, BlackRock and how much they control around the world. What I can do is work on myself, and that's what we should be doing. Work on yourself and become the best version of you in this lifetime. And it means different things to different people. Become good at something. Develop that skill that you've always wanted to develop. Maybe meditate and do yoga if you want to become more spiritual, more grounded. Especially if you're easily triggered by stuff. Meditation will help you to not get easily triggered. Just do whatever is necessary to become the best possible human being in this lifetime. And then change starts from within. Don't try to change everybody around you. Change yourself first. And be an example that other people want to follow. It's a lot better, in my opinion, to be a leader who other people want to follow because of who you are than trying to convince others or tell them, hey, you should follow me because whatever.
Well, it's by the example that you set. And it's like, changing yourself is hard enough, and changing other people is actually impossible.
Exactly. Read books, watch videos that will help you to become a better person. Maybe, learn a new skill. Whatever it takes. Just focus on improving yourself and being a better version of yourself on Tuesday than you were on Monday. That's it. That's your only competition. Don't look at others. Doesn't matter how wealthy they are, or it doesn't matter, because they have their own path and you have your own path, because you came here for a reason. You're not here by accident. This is not an accident, as much as some people would like to believe. No. You're here for a reason, and I think we're in a period of transition, massive transition. And we're going to see massive change, system-level change, over the next 30 years and 40 years. And we will say, oh, wow, things have really changed between, say, 2000 and 2060 in the next 40 years. So mark my words.
Well, they certainly will be. Well, folks, we are recording in a study room in the library, and the next person has let us know that he's got this room booked, so we're going to end there. I just want to say it's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you.
It's been really nice to meet you, and I'm really looking forward to, continued conversations, maybe have you on again
Episode
someday.
2.
This I've got two other episodes in the bank that I got to get my ass editing. But no, it's been a great conversation, and yeah, we're in really challenging and really transformational times, and I'm glad to have people like you around to have conversations with, and to help to, in some ways, we get to, through conversation with one another, whether you agree or disagree with people, we get to correct our thinking and challenge our thinking, and that's all part of the becoming better human beings. And I find one of the biggest challenges, the language that I use around the biggest challenge for me, and that I see in our society, is that we just need to grow up. We have, like Gabor Mate talks about how there are a lot of children walking around in adult bodies, and we see that with the environment that we find ourselves in. And I'm trying to grow up and take care of myself better, and take care of my family and my relationships, and the sphere of influence that I actually have influence over, but primarily myself, and to take on more responsibility. And yeah, we're gonna have to just see
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Dan.
To unfold.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Cool, man.
They want to split us into subjective identity-based groups, right? With terminology like cisgendered white males and all that stuff.
Holla! Awesome, man.
Thank you. This was awesome.
Yeah.
Looking good. Oh yeah, fuck yeah.